The sons of Ragnar were watching the battlefield, scanning the faces of the dying, looking for one specific crown. King Aella saw his army disintegrate. He saw his rival die. He realized, with dawning horror, that the walls he had just breached were now his prison cells. He tried to retreat, but the path was blocked by a wall of Danish shields. He was surrounded. He was dragged from his horse, stripped of his weapons, forced to his knees in the mire of blood and dirt. The Battle of York was over. The silence returned to the city, broken only by the groans of the dying. The Vikings didn't execute Aella on the spot. That would have been mercy. Instead, they bound him in chains. They looked at him not with anger, but with terrifying sense of anticipation. The war was finished. The ritual was about to begin. King Aella was dragged into the center of the Great Hall of York. He was covered in mud and blood, his royal robes torn, his crown long gone. Around him stood the victorious chieftains of the Great Heathen Army. But Aella's eyes were fixed on the four men sitting on the dais, the sons of Ragnar. Bjorn Ironside sat with massive arms crossed, looking at Aella like a butcher looks at beef. Ubba played with the handle of his axe. Sigurd Snake in the Eye watched with that unnerving, unblinking stare. But the terrifying presence in the room was the man who couldn't even stand up. Ivar the Boneless lay on a pile of furs, his twisted legs useless, but his eyes burning with cold reptilian intelligence. This was the moment the prophecy came full circle. Aella looked at them and saw the little piglets his prisoner had warned him about. But they were not piglets, they were wolves. Ivar didn't scream or rage. He likely spoke softly, asking Aella about the pit. Did my father cry out? Did he beg? How long did it take for the venom to stop his heart? Every question was a knife twist. Ivar was forcing Aella to relive his crime, to admit he had killed a hero without honor. Aella had denied Ragnar a weapon to die with. Now Ivar would deny Aella a quick death. In the Viking code, a clean death, a decapitation or sword to the heart, was a mercy. It was respectful. But Aella had forfeited his right to respect. There was no negotiation for ransom, no offer of exile. Ivar signaled to his guards. They dragged Aella out to a nearby hill, visible to both the Viking army and the terrified survivors of York. The time for talk was over. They prepared the ground for the Blood Eagle. King Aella was forced onto his stomach. His hands and feet were staked into the ground, stretching him taut. He was no longer a king. He was a canvas for Ivar's masterpiece. The Blood Eagle, or Blothern in Old Norse, is perhaps the most infamous method of execution in human history. For a long time, historians argued it was just a myth, a scary story. But for King Aella, on that cold Northumbrian afternoon, it was physically, agonizingly real. The executioner, likely Ivar himself, or a specialist chosen for surgical precision, approached with a long knife. This wasn't clumsy hacking, it was anatomy. First, the skin of Aella's back was sliced open. 2 long, curved incisions were made along the spine from the shoulder blades down to the lower back. The skin was peeled back like flaps of parchment, exposing the layer of red muscle and the white cage of the ribs underneath. At this point, Aella would have been screaming in a way that stripped his throat raw. Then came the hammer and chisel. This is the part that defines the torture. The executioner didn't just cut, he deconstructed. One by one, the ribs were severed from the spine. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of snapping bone echoed across the silent field. The ribs were then forced outward, bent back to resemble the spread wings of a bird. The man was being turned inside out while conscious. But the ritual wasn't finished. With the chest cavity now open to the air, the executioner reached inside. The final act was to pull the lungs out from the chest cavity and drape them over the broken ribs. As the lungs collapsed and fluttered with the dying man's final ragged breaths, the movement of the red tissue looked like the beating of wings, a blood-soaked eagle trying to take flight from the ruin of a man's body. Medical experts today suggest that Aella likely died from traumatic shock or pneumothorax, ECT, the collapse of the lungs, before the process was fully complete. But the Vikings believed that if the victim cried out, he would not enter Valhalla. Aella screamed. He died not as a warrior, but as a sacrifice to Odin, his body transformed into a grotesque symbol of Viking dominance. When the deed was done, Aella's body was left there as a warning to every other king in England. The debt was paid. The old boar had been avenged. But as the sons of Ragnar wiped the blood from their hands, they realized something. The rage hadn't subsided. The adrenaline was still pumping. Aella was dead, but there were other kings in England. There were other torturers. And the Great Heathen Army was still hungry. With Aella dead and Northumbria broken, a normal army would have gone home. They had their revenge, they had their justice. But the Great Heathen Army didn't turn back to the sea, they turned south. In 869 AD, they returned to East Anglia, the kingdom where they had first landed. King Edmund of East Anglia had given them horses 3 years earlier, hoping to buy his safety. He thought he had a deal, but Ivar the Boneless didn't honor deals with men he considered prey. When the Vikings returned, they didn't ask for horses. They asked for the kingdom. King Edmund was a pious man, a devout Christian who refused to fight a war he couldn't win, but also refused to submit to a pagan overlord. He was captured near Hoxne, and here Ivar decided to make another example. If Aella's death was about anatomy, Edmund's death was about archery. According to the Passion of Saint Edmund, Ivar ordered the king to be tied to a tree. He wanted to see if the Christian God would save his faithful servant. The Viking archers lined up. This wasn't an execution by firing squad, it was torture by volume. They fired volley after volley. They didn't aim for the heart or the head. That would be too quick. They aimed for the arms, the legs, the shoulders. The chroniclers wrote that Edmund was shot with so many arrows that he resembled a hedgehog, his body bristling with shafts, pinned against the bark of the tree, bleeding from a dozen non-fatal wounds simultaneously. Throughout the ordeal, Edmund refused to renounce his faith. He kept calling out to Christ. This infuriated Ivar. The boneless commander had no patience for martyrs. Bored with the game, Ivar gave the final order. A swordsman stepped forward and severed Edmund's head with a single blow, tossing it deep into the thick brambles of the forest so his followers couldn't bury him whole. King Edmund the Martyr died not because he killed Ragnar, but because he stood in the path of the avalanche. His death sent a clear message to the remaining kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia. There is no negotiation, there is no neutrality. You either die screaming like Aella, or you die praying like Edmund. But either way, you die. By 874 AD, the Great Heathen Army had effectively decapitated 2 of the 4 great kingdoms of England. Northumbria was a puppet state, East Anglia was a graveyard. Next on the list was Mercia, the massive kingdom in the Midlands. The king of Mercia, Burgred, looked at the fate of Aella and the fate of Edmund. He saw the blood eagle and the hedgehog. He realized that the sons of Ragnar were not men you could negotiate with, nor were they men you could beat. So Burgred made a choice that history has judged harshly. He didn't fight, he didn't pray, he ran. As the Vikings advanced on his capital at Repton, Burgred abdicated his throne. He took as much gold as he could carry and fled to Rome. He died there, an exile, buried far from the land he was sworn to protect. It was a pathetic end to a once proud lineage. The Vikings didn't even have to unsheathe their swords to conquer Mercia. Fear had done the work for them. Now look at the map of England. It is almost entirely black. Only one kingdom remained independent, the kingdom of Wessex in the south. Wessex was the last stand. If it fell, England would cease to exist. It would simply become a western extension of Scandinavia. But in Wessex, they found something they hadn't encountered before. They didn't find an arrogant tyrant like Aella, or a passive martyr like Edmund, or a coward like Burgred. They found a young man named Alfred. At this time, Alfred was not yet the Great. He was a sickly prince, plagued by chronic stomach pain, often overshadowed by his warrior brother King Ethelred. But Alfred possessed a weapon that Ivar the Boneless respected, a brilliant tactical mind. When the Vikings attacked Reading in 871, the battles were brutal and inconclusive. The losses on both sides were catastrophic. Unlike the other kingdoms, Wessex bit back. When his brother died, Alfred took the crown in the middle of a war zone. He looked at the exhausted state of his army and did the unthinkable. He paid the Vikings to leave. He gave them a massive tribute of silver known as the Danegeld. Critics might call this cowardice, similar to Burgred, but there was a key difference. Burgred paid to save his own skin. Alfred paid to buy time. He knew he couldn't defeat the Great Heathen Army in a pitched battle yet. He needed to reform his military, build ships, and study his enemy. He was buying 5 years of silence. In 870 A.D., after the execution of King Edmund, the most terrifying man in Europe simply vanished. Ivar the Boneless disappears from the English historical records. For centuries, the sudden silence puzzled historians. To find the answer, we have to look across the Irish Sea to the Annals of Ulster. Here, Ivar reappears under the name Imar, the king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. It seems that after breaking the back of the English kingdoms, Ivar returned to his stronghold in Dublin to rule as an emperor of the north, but the gods are known for their irony. Ivar, the man who engineered the Blood Eagle, the man who turned cities into slaughterhouses, did not die a warrior's death. He wasn't cut down in battle. He didn't ascend to Valhalla with a sword in his hand. In 873 A.D., the annals record that Ivar died of a sudden, hideous disease. The man whose mind was a weapon, but whose body was a burden, was finally betrayed by his own physiology. It is a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for a figure of such legendary violence. He died in his bed, likely surrounded by looted gold, but defeated by his own biology. However, legend offers a different, more haunting ending that fits the myth better than the history. According to Viking folklore, before he died, Ivar ordered his body to be transported back to England. He gave specific instructions to be buried on the coast at the very spot where the Vikings first landed to invade. His prophecy was that as long as his bones remained in the English soil guarding the coast, no foreign invader would ever successfully conquer England. The legend claims that in 1066, when William the Conqueror prepared to invade England from Normandy, he found Ivar's burial mound, dug up the corpse, which remarkably had not decayed, and burned it to ashes on a pyre. Only after Ivar's physical form was destroyed did William feel safe enough to launch his conquest. The revenge of the Great Heathen Army was complete success. King Aella died via Blood Eagle. King Edmund became a martyr. The north and east belonged to the Vikings. They had hunted down every single man responsible for Ragnar Lothbrok's death. Subscribe to Great History for more battles where revenge transformed into conquest and tactical genius defeated kingdoms through systematic brutality and psychological warfare that changed England forever.